Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back to the Authentic Man podcast. This episode, this is a fun episode to record, actually. So this is an episode, we're talking about intercultural dating and relationships, and how to have those move smoothly, basically. I think this is something that people really struggle with. And I say this because I've seen this so much, where they fail to create what's needed inside the relationship to create cohesion, and a lot of the cultural problems surface and cause issues in their relationship. And I got talking to a friend of mine, Hakeem, or Kimmy, as I often know him as, from the Anti-Racist Social Club. And we decided to do an episode about it because it's something we both know about. I've been in many interracial relationships. I've kind of learned my own way of introducing my partner into my family and integrating myself into their family, because I see that as and we talk about this a lot in the podcast. This is the key component I see that people get wrong, is that they meet a partner who is, the kind of standard one we see on TV and media is a black man meets a white woman, or a black woman meets a white man, and the instability happens when they don't connect the families together or the cultures together and explain the differences between the family. And this is something we go into detail about in the episode. Me and Kimmy really get into detail. We also talk a lot about the importance of allyship, the importance of doing the work, or doing the anti-racist work, the work that would have you look at your biases, yourself, your partner's biases, and also your family biases, and how to kind of break down any family, I'm going to call it racially problematic behavior within your family, potentially, that would be a barrier to allowing your partner to fully integrate. And we talk about our own experiences. We talk about how we've been able to do it in our own lives. And I really talk especially towards the end of the episode, I really talk about kind of a step-by-step, the ways in which I've done that with myself, and also in some of the questions that are going to come up inside, if you're dating interracially, interculturally, they're going to come up in your family, and how to deal with them, and how to deal with them in a way that is powerful, and how to deal with a way that allows people to grow and your relationship to flourish. So this is a really good episode. Basically, you're going to laugh a lot. You're going to really enjoy this. Kimmy, as I said, he does a lot of work around, racially problematic behavior within companies. He runs the Anti-Racist Social Club, which really is about engaging in, predominantly white spaces, be that companies or organizations, and kind of helping them with their, diversity inclusion, which is commonly known as. He has a little name that, I don't know if he wants me to mention this, but I'm going to mention it anyway. He goes by, often called the White Whisperer, because, he understands how things can be for white people, as I do. Because we've just been in enough white spaces to understand what the experience of a black man is like, and also being in the white space, you understand how to bridge those things. And I think that's often missing in our society, that level. And it was good to have this conversation because, equally last year I did a lot of work around, after the George Floyd incident, I did a lot of work in my previous company around how we can, do diversity and inclusion, but also how we can start to have difficult conversations in a safe and open way. And ultimately, the thing was compassion. That's what kept coming up, was when we can have compassion for each other, we can have these conversations. So This episode is full of some wonderful tidbits. You can get some great knowledge from this. If you're new to this, if you before you get into the episode, I'm just going to say, like, if you enjoy it, please get in contact and let me know what you enjoyed and what come up for you. Please check out Kimmy's the Anti-Racist Social Club. In the show notes, you see the link for it there. He's got some events coming up, a comedy night and so forth, and you should definitely engage with him on Instagram as well. Again, show notes all down there for you. The last thing before we get into the episode, though, is I've got a few events coming up. I've got a Tantra for Couples coming up on the 28th of November, at 5 o'clock UK time. I've got Tantra for Solo People. That's on the 5th of December at 5 p.m. Again, those are both Sundays. Running those with my wonderful partner, Orsa, who gets plenty of mentions in this episode. And I've also got an event I'm running myself called Being Authentically Attractive, and that's a co-ed event, men and women, people of all genders, talking about how we can be authentically attractive instead of, unauthentically attractive or manipulation attractive, as often we are told we need to be. And that's on the 9th of December at 7:30. And the event I'm really looking forward to is one we're doing with Orsa, which is how to create conscious relationships. That's one thing we really put together. If you haven't listened to that episode, you're going to learn a lot if I listen to that episode. That's episode 100. But that event's going to happen on the 12th of December at 5 o'clock UK time. So that's all the wonderful events I've got coming up. You can find the links in the show notes, or you can find them on Instagram with me. But, without further ado, I'll let you get into this episode and learn a ton of things about intercultural dating and relationships. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a wonderful episode here with a wonderful man that I've got to know through the wonderful world of Instagram and social media. We often bemoan social media and say how terrible it is and how it ruins all of our lives. But I can say that I've met some amazing people I've met in real life and hung out with and had drinks with and had dinner with and become friends with. And this is one of those people. And I'd like to introduce you to Kimmy.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
I'm not great, if I'm being honest. I think often we are just used to sort of saying, "Oh yeah, I'm good. How are you?" But if I'm being authentic, I've been going through it. I've been sort of overwhelmed and stressed. I run two organizations. One of them a charity called the Interracial Social Club, and I also have just been going through a complicated breakup. And it's just gotten to a point where it's all sort of bubbling up. And because of some childhood trauma that I'm still working through, I'm just really good with coping with trauma and not actually experiencing my emotions. So it's like new for me to actually like process my emotions. And I'm like 28 years old. I'm like, what the fuck? So, sorry. Should I stop cussing? Like, just let me know if that's like, I need to censor myself. Okay.
No, not at all.
Okay, cool. Cause I'm very fluent. But I'm not doing great. And also and I know that I can get through it, or that I have to get through it, I guess. I don't know if one or the other. I think it's sort of like, I read something at some point where it's like, we're just built to get through things. Like at some point, like little by little, day by day, like things just get better because you get more distant from the experience. And so I think while I'm going through it, it's going to feel like a challenge. And that's okay, because even though it's new for me, I sort of just have to get used to experiencing these emotions and not just suppressing them. And so I'm not doing great, and hopefully I find the support that I need. How are you?
No, I'm gonna say thank you for sharing so openly how you're feeling. Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm slowly getting back to a place of just not being overwhelmed, just giving myself some space and time to do the things in the mornings that I know I need to do to keep me in a good place. I had a really beautiful Reiki session yesterday, actually.
Okay.
With a woman that I go and see. She doesn't live that too far away from me, and it was just like incredibly relaxing. So that was beautiful.
I've done Reiki once. It'd be something I think I would give a shot again too. Me and mindfulness, like I know I need it. I know the things that are tried and true for people, but the yoga and the meditation and they're not my favorite. But yeah, Reiki is something that I'd be interested to try again, as well as like sound baths, like
Yes.
whatever those bowls are when people like hit them and stuff like that. That's like music and audio that does speak to me. So maybe I just need
Mm.
to like sit and listen to those sort of things, and we'll see how that goes. So yeah, we'll
Mm.
see.
I'll send you over a few links actually afterwards. Actually, I've been to quite a few that are really nice
It'll be brilliant. Thank you.
in live ones. So Kimmy, what the I didn't introduce the work that you do. I think probably you're much better at introducing the work that you do now.
Fair enough. Yeah. So as a result of the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and countless others, but those three sort of brought the spotlight back to police brutality and racism last summer. I started a charity called the Interracial Social Club. So we work with organizations, businesses, schools, to make them more inclusive and diverse and equitable. So we like to say that we make racism fun, not the experience of it, but at least talking about it. And for me, it's all about taking the shame and the guilt out of the conversation. I just found that so often people weren't engaging in the conversations that they needed to because they were afraid, or they didn't feel like they had the right resources. And so initially I thought, okay, well, let's make a website and just, put all of the resources that were available in one place. And then I thought, okay, well, I want to teach, I want to engage. And so started doing workshops. And then a year later, it just sort of turned into what it is. And now we're starting to do anti-bullying and inclusion and anti-racism like workshops with students, and in addition to businesses. It's just sort of growing, and it's exciting, and it's like running a startup. Though it's also overwhelming and stressful, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge, and it's mentally draining at times as well. I think I've sometimes forgotten how challenging that can be because of the topics you're talking about. I'm so often sharing my lived experience, and so often sharing the racism or the homophobia or whatever that I've experienced, and that can be mentally draining. And so it's rewarding, but it's also challenging. And at the end of the day, we aim to bring psychological safety to different spaces. So I always talk about anti-racism being intersectional, and that if Black Lives Matter, then Black gay lives matter, Black female lives matter. So we work with organizations to help be more diverse in all aspects of identity. So gender, socioeconomic background, sexuality, race and ethnicity, neurodiversity. So it's a safe space for everyone. And yeah, that's a little bit about what we do.
Beautiful work that is much needed in the world. I think it's, as you said, it's people want to have the conversations, but they're so scared to get it wrong. I experienced this last year when I was working for my previous company, and I started to come forward and talk about my lived experience. And a lot of people were like, great, I love listening to it. And then he'd say, okay, what's your experience? As a white man or a white woman. And they'd be like, oh, well, I'm really scared to talk about this because I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to get anything wrong. And I would usually just say, look, if you just say the wrong thing in front of me, to me, it's okay. Because I know that you want to have this. It's better to have the conversation and say something wrong here and there, right? And be open to being corrected, right? And be open to then get it right the next time.
And that's
then
key.
To say,
being open to be corrected. Yeah.
Yeah. Then saying, I don't want to get it wrong, so I'm not going to have the conversation.
Yep. Yeah. Like I'm always telling people that silence becomes complicity, becomes oppression. And when you don't speak up, and that you let your fragility or your anxiety lead to inaction, then you become a part of the problem. And so that's what we try to do. We try to take the shame and the guilt out of the conversation. Any engagement I lead, I have one rule, which is don't say the N-word. And that's literally like the one rule that I put on people. And other than that, I want people to feel like it's a safe space, right? And I want people to feel like they can speak their mind. There's a caveat to that, right? With anything, you can't go to an airport and yell bomb without consequences, right? So we're not sort of say whatever you feel without any regard for anyone's feelings, but we are a space where we say, look, be vulnerable, right? Let's hear what you're actually feeling and thinking. And if you get it wrong, you get it wrong. Like, we're all going to fuck up, right? Like that's normal. But what's important is that we at least engage. So I jokingly call myself the white whisperer, and that's mainly because of the environments I've grown up in, right? And when we start talking about the topic that we're talking about today, it all comes back to the fact that I've grown up in white dominated spaces, and that for me just made me think that I've got a different way of approaching these topics because I'm used to being in those spaces. And so yeah, I think that's what I bring to the conversation. I bring my lived experience as a gay Black male, as someone who's lived in the US and the UK and Australia, who's worked in white dominated professional spaces. I sort of bring all of that together, add in sort of my experiences with mental health and my training around mental health, and sort of just you get this charity. So that's, yeah, it's exciting work, and I'm so excited to see, you know, where it's going to lead to.
Beautiful. I guess a question actually is what did you do? What was your lead up to that? What brought you? What was your life before you did this beautiful work?
I was working in corporate. I studied business, and my first job was in a big consulting firm. I was helping businesses make more money, and that wasn't creative enough for me. So I started working in the public sector and trying to do like public relations work, and that was very creative, but not strategic enough for me. So I sort of was trying to find that balance. I took some time off and took a little bit of sabbatical. I was an au pair to 3 little girls. I started doing stand-up comedy in that little break. And then I moved to the UK 3 years ago, or I should say I moved to London, because, you know, London versus the UK is a very different beast. But I moved to London 3 years ago and have been working in different strategy positions, innovation consulting, design thinking. So it's always been strategy, and it's always been sort of helping organizations with something. And what happened last summer was one of the impetus to starting the organization. The racial trauma I was experiencing, I needed some sort of catharsis, and so I wanted to channel that into something. And the other reason was that it took the world pausing because of COVID for me to realize that I'd never felt psychological safety ever in any organization that I've been in. A lot of my previous organizations, and specifically the last 2 that I worked in, were not safe spaces at all for me. I couldn't bring my full self to work or to screen when we were remote. And I actually had an experience this year where the CEO accused me of pulling the race card when I was raising concerns of being the only Black person in the organization. And I was actually getting asked by leadership, like, why does it matter you're the only Black person? Like, how does that change your experience? And just the microaggressions from the CEO all the way down just got to me. And I was like, I don't have to put up with this. So I went freelance and started doing sort of innovation work separately, and then the charity as well. So leading up to it, it was always strategy in white dominated spaces, like a version of myself that wasn't authentic, but was what it needed to be to operate and succeed in the world. And then the pandemic, COVID, and racism, which is a pandemic, which I'm writing an article that's coming out soon about breaking that down. But both of those pandemics together just made me realize, like, yeah, something's got to change. So I need something different. I need to get out of these spaces and then try to help them from the outside. So I'm sort of still in the spaces, but now it's a different perspective. Now I'm sort of helping them become safer spaces so that the next generation of people like me don't have to go through what I went through and don't have to hide themselves. And so that's sort of the lead up to where I'm at now. And I bring that innovation and design thinking and strategic background to the charity space. So I run the charity as if it's a startup. And for me, that means that we're able to adapt more and better help our partners become, more inclusive, because it's not the same sort of stuffy approach that just hasn't been working, in my opinion, for decades. It's sort of a new, fun, fresh way to talk about these issues, and that's what's exciting about the work, is that I get to keep it fun and engaging, as difficult as it can be sometimes. I know that every conversation that I have is leading towards something better, and so that's the sort of reward. And hopefully I see the fruits of that labor at some point in the future. But for now, I'm sort of just happy knowing that I'm changing things, one chat at a time.
Life-changing conversations, organization changing conversations.
I hope so. That's the goal, at least.
Yeah, because I definitely have the similar experience of working the corporate ladder, being in, I guess being in London, they're multicultural spaces, but they're always at least 50% white spaces. And I grew up.
I mean, let's be honest, at least 60, 65, probably.
Yeah, maybe. I work in tech, so tech has a slightly different mix, doesn't it? But like a leadership level, it's always for sure. White space. And I guess with my upbringing, I guess maybe I don't talk about this. Like, I grew up in East London, very multicultural. Like, a lot of my best friends are Muslim, Pakistani, Indians, Sikhs. Like, I grew up around. I played a lot of cricket, so I knew a lot of South Asians, as you would say. But I grew up with friends who were Spanish. So I grew up, and then my family are Jamaican, and my mum's got Jamaican friends. So I grew up in this way where it's just like I was always used to being around different cultures. So I, like yourself, I'm just like, oh, I'm used to that. If I go into a room and it's like only white people in the room, I will notice and be like, oh, this is strange, because rooms aren't normally like this. Like, other than like office, like if I'm going to a bar or something, that's a bit odd, but I won't feel out of place. And if I go to a party and there's just black people there, I'm probably likely to feel more out of place, because that's the less likely thing that's happened in my life, right? Because of where we've come from. But I think we'll get into this.
It's so interesting you mentioned that, because the first time I feel like it was like reverse culture shock when I moved to Atlanta in a previous life, which is a predominantly Black city. And it was one of the first times where I can still remember getting on public transportation, call it the Metro in the States. And there were so many Black people. I'd never seen that many Black people in one place in my life. And I sort of had this moment of like, oh my God, like it's exactly what you said. At least you sort of notice it. I mean, I'm so used to being in all white spaces that you don't often notice it. But when you're in a space where there's more non-white people, it's sort of like, oh, okay, this is different, right? And it's so interesting that we even have this dichotomy of people of color and white versus non-white, because if you think about the actual definition of people of color, it's people not from the European heritage and the Caucasus, and that's the majority of the world, right? When you take into account the populations of India and China, the majority of the world is people of color, except we have this sort of dichotomy of like, oh, white and non-white, and it just creates this us versus them mentality, and it's problematic for a lot of reasons. But it's sort of, how did a group of people get the majority of power being in the minority? It's a historical study that it's still, the jury's still out, and it's very interesting. But yeah, another chat for another day on that.
Yeah. Definitely.
People want to talk about sex and relationships, David.
Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna get into interracial dating, because this is something that I've experienced a lot in my life. And when we first hung out and we talked, we were like, yeah, this is definitely something we've both experienced, but also something I know that people want to hear about. Like, I've done a few episodes before with a few friends before, and there's always been stuff that people are really interested in. So I guess the first place to start is what is an internet racial relationship?
Yeah.
Like, what does an interracial relationship look like to you?
Yeah. So I even hate that we call it interracial relationships, because I mean, if we get into the topic of like race versus ethnicity, like race is, I mean, it's a social construct, right? But it's obviously has a place in our world, and race is more about our skin color and our hair texture, like the biological aspects of us, and ethnicity is more about our culture and our background. And so I wish we called it interethnic dating more, because that would probably be more accurate. But as a term in general, interracial dating is just the idea that people from different backgrounds are dating. So probably the easiest way is, someone who's Black, someone who's white, they're dating. And that wasn't actually illegal until pretty recently. And Loving v. Virginia, I should know that because I'm from Virginia, was the Supreme Court's case, which allowed for interracial marriage. And so it's not that, like, we're not that far removed from a time where it was illegal.
Yeah.
And so that is something I think is so interesting, that we're so close to that. And that I think as a society, we maybe feel like we're so far ahead than we really are. But interracial dating is this idea that different cultures are coming together. And I love the idea of interracial dating. I think it's going to be how we solve so many of the problems of the world, but it's not without its challenges, obviously.
Yeah. And it's interesting to say that we're not far removed from when it wasn't legal. Like, I always think back to a friend of mine, someone I haven't seen for a long time, and her parents are probably now in their probably like 60s, maybe even retired, right? And her mum is Scottish, and I think her dad is Jamaican. So they would have met, I don't know, maybe like way back in the 70s, maybe, even. And I remember her telling the story of how her parents said what life was like for them, and how they're saying how, people wouldn't let them into bars, people would spit at them, people would shout obscene things at them across the road, and all these sorts of things in the 70s. And, I always say this is like, when you see a mixed race person, right, or a person of mixed heritage, mixed culture, who is maybe in their, I don't know, 30s or 40s, I always think back to their parents, because I'm like, wow, when you were born, when your parents went into the hospital to have you, the hospital would have reacted to that relationship in an openly negative way, and they would have been allowed to, and there would have been nothing stopping this. Like, we don't always think about, like, even in the 80s, there was still, like, I definitely know a friend of mine, she said how when her mother fell pregnant, and I think she's half Jamaican as well, when her mother fell pregnant, her mother's father was just like, you're polluting our bloodline. And it's like, in this, where we are now, we forget that the history of this is like, it was very hostile for people, quite a number of years ago, to
life-threatening, not just like we disdain, or we don't like it. It's like people were violent towards interracial couples, and it's a history that we can't forget, because it's still, like you said, it's still a mindset, I think, of older generations, especially, of like, date within your race, right? Like, I do think that there are genuine reasons why people say it, right? Like, especially for groups of people, like from marginalized communities, where you want to maintain your sense of culture, right? And you also know that it's probably going to be easier to date someone within your culture. And so I can understand why parents would say things like, date within your culture, right? Because they see that as a way to make your life easier. So I get it. It comes from a genuine place. And I also think people are against it because they're scared, right? They're scared of losing their identity or their cultural identity through their children, or they're scared of the difficulties that might exist. So there's genuine reasons why people are afraid, right? But like with any phobia, right, we have to challenge the irrational fears with education, right? We have to fight the ignorance with facts, and we have to recognize that interracial relationships are actually a way to save the world. Like, as dramatic as that sounds, like it's a way for cultural divides to lessen, and it's a way for people to recognize that there's beauty in diversity, and that when we have more people growing up of mixed heritage, that we are allowing people to explore different sides of themselves, and showcase to the world that we can be in harmony. And I think the challenge, though, is that the way things are now, the world doesn't see mixed race as beautiful, right? You see a half Black, half white child, and they're Black, right? And that's how they're treated. And so they're not given the respect or respect's the wrong word, but they're not even given the privilege of the fact that they're half white, right?
Mm.
Like, so I think that's one challenge as well. And the other one is that I mentioned before, I wish it was called, interethnic dating, because, I'm not going to even try to claim that I know all of the history of the UK. I'm still learning it, but the Troubles showcase that it's not just about skin color, right? You could have two white people from completely different cultural backgrounds, completely different religious backgrounds, still have challenges with families, right, mixing together, or with two individuals coming together. So we have to get out of this idea that it's just a problem for people who look different, right? You can have two Black people, you can have two white people, you can have two Hispanic people who come from vastly different cultures and still find it a challenge to date together. And I think that's why we have to start recognizing that it's not just a skin color thing.
Yeah. Like I've got a lot of friends, for instance. I can think of one friend actually, and him and his wife are both Indian. And she, with India, it's a really obvious one, right? Because we understand the idea of the caste system and so forth. If you're not quite aware of the caste system, I think the best way to describe it is that there are certain family lines and castes which are higher than that are higher than others. There's one at the bottom, which I think they're known, is it the Dalits? I can't remember. I spent some time in India, and they're like, even certain names are associated with that caste, and they're seen as the lowest of the low, the street cleaners and blah, blah, blah. And then you've got the higher ones up, like the Brahmins and so forth, are seen as like priests and so forth, and family lines. And people won't marry into caste often in India, in many places. Like I remember being in India and someone showing me a newspaper, and it was what's it called? It showed it was like ads, like, I'm looking for a man, I'm blah 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 this age, and people still stated their caste.
Oh wow.
Right. And that was in 2015 when I was there. And I imagine that's something that's dying out a bit more. That's still a problem.
Added the mix of religions as well. Like there's
you can't marry into religion. That's a problem as well. But even if you're from the Caribbean and you want to be with someone who's African, right, that can throw up its own problems inside of families. Like that's something a lot of white folk, let's just be straight, they don't always realize that can be problematic, because I know for a lot of Jamaicans there's this idea, especially when we're talking about West Africans, it's like, you sold us, like how dare you sold us off, that kind of rhetoric, right? So it is such a complex thing. And then if you add inside of white communities, for instance, we in the UK, we grew up with the Northern Ireland, right? The subject of Northern Ireland, Catholics and Protestants. I've got a friend of mine work colleague, and he's Scottish, and he got married to a woman and she wasn't particularly religious, right? And he had to really make it look like she was more Catholic than she was, because that would be a problem to his family.
Yeah.
So as you said, it's like we often think of interracial, intercultural, interethnic dating as just like Black people, white people, Asian people, white people.
It's more complex than that.
Yeah. It has a lot of complexity involved in making it work, actually. And I think one of the first questions I want to talk about, and the next question I want to talk about, is about when did you first realize that you were open to dating outside of your race and ethnicity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it sort of flows from the conversation we were just having around, like, the more and more I think about these topics, it's a lot to do with family, like that. It's familial pressure that gets put on people to start to think like, oh, I can't do that, or I can do that. So, like I said, I grew up in a very conservative military town, white dominated spaces. There's only ever one or two Black people in a class. If there was three, the quota was off. Some other class didn't have one of us. So, I strongly believe that your sort of sexual preferences form during puberty, right? So as a gay man, my sexuality formed during that time as well, but also my attraction to different people formed at that time. And if you think about, I'm going through puberty, who's around me that I can find attractive was all white men. So I only dated white men for the longest time. And at some points I sort of thought to myself, am I racist? Like, am I racist against my own people? Which, technically I couldn't have been, because, power structures wasn't there, but am I discriminating against my own people? And it took me in therapy to sort of recognize that on the one hand, my preference wasn't some choice that I made. There was a lot of factors, right, that get built into that. One of them being the fact that what was around me during puberty was white men, but also pressure from family. It turns out most of the people of my immediate siblings were dating white people, and there was familial pressure from my immigrant parents who there's sort of, what does that mean for our culture, and are we losing our sense of culture? And there's pressure of like, oh, you're not gonna be liked in a white family. So there's genuine, valid sort of like concerns from parents who are like, want safety for their children, right? And you're getting that pressure, and you're getting sort of pressure from media or cultural representations of what beauty is, right? Like Eurocentric visions of beauty are what dominate, especially in the UK and in America, media representations of love. So when you look at the actors or the models or the people who are famous, they tend to be white, and they tend to be these white, attractive people. And so all of that together formulated this preference for white people that I never really challenged until I started doing more of this work. And honestly, it was probably during the pandemic where I started to recognize what was what. Like, yes, my preference was guided by my how I grew up in my childhood. And also slightly the fact that I just didn't want to date anyone that reminded me of my siblings for probably obvious reasons. This isn't Game of Thrones. I'm not Cersei. And so like, if I would see someone who looked like my siblings, I'd be like, okay, I don't want to date them. And before I realized that, it was, I just think I like lighter skinned Black men. So Michael Ealy, light skinned Black man, beautiful eyes. Like that was one of my childhood crushes. And I was like, okay, well, I can't be racist. Like I like Michael Ealy, right? And so it wasn't until I started to work through it and realize like, it wasn't a light skin thing. It was just the fact that my siblings were a little bit darker, and I didn't want to date someone who reminded me of my siblings. Because again, I'm not Cersei. So I sort of was just like, okay, I'm starting to realize where this preference is coming from. And it was during the pandemic, like I mentioned, when I was starting to do this work, that I started to recognize that I was biased myself, and that I had to fight my lazy thinking. And so one thing that I would mention to people is that let's stop with this idea that because we engage in racially problematic behavior, that we are racist, right? Let's separate the behavior from our personhood, because I think it makes it easier for us to actually challenge our behavior when we focus on it, right? It's the same way when we talk about raising kids, right? How we want to be saying things like, that's bad listening, or that's good eating, as opposed to you're a bad boy, you're a good girl. We don't want people to internalize the negative emotion, right? So we want people to recognize that they can engage in racially problematic behavior without being a racist, right? So for me, I was biased against my own community because of media representations, because of who I grew up with, et cetera. And once I had that realization, that's when I sort of actively started changing I wouldn't say I was actively changing my preferences, but I was actively allowing myself to find beauty in other things. And I think it's a big challenge when it comes to dating on dating apps, like most of us probably are doing, because you only, I think the average I read somewhere was like 3.4 seconds or something like that you look at someone's profile. It's probably even, I mean, you're so quickly looking at photographs, right? So if you imagine the fact that we've got implicit and unconscious bias, right? That we've got these media representations based on Eurocentric visions of beauty, that we've got these microaggressions that we're engaging in constantly. You add in all of these things together, and then you give us 3.4 seconds to notice someone's profile, right? Yeah. It's just a recipe for disaster. So we're constantly swiping left, right, and we're not even paying attention to what we're seeing. Yeah. And so when I actually started to slow down and focus on what I was looking at, I started to appreciate the beauty in other cultures and other ethnicities. And And I think, it takes that conscious level of awareness to be able to fight that ignorance and fight that bias, because as I mentioned, if you're moving so fast, right, then you start to say things like, oh, well, they're not my type, right? And so it's a fine line between having a type and being racially problematic, right?
Yeah.
If you say things like, oh, well, I tend to date this personality trait, or I tend to date this type of person, but I'm open to other types of people, okay, that's one thing. But if you start to say things like, oh, well, I don't date Black people because their features don't appeal to me, that's a whole nother ballgame that we have to address, because that's problematic, right? When you start assigning negative qualities to things people can't change about themselves, their race or ethnicity, that's when we start to cross that line of, okay, is that a preference, or is that bias? Because we all have preference, right? And it's not a bad thing to have preference, but are you open to that preference being challenged, right?
Yes.
That's the key question. I don't want people to have a takeaway of, oh, well, I'm racist because I only like white people. Like that's not what we're saying here, right? What we're saying is, are you able to challenge your own thinking and recognize that biases that you're not even aware of are informing your decision making, right? And are you, one of my closest friends, he hates when I talk about this, but he knows I talk about it because it's a great example. We're sitting on the couch one day, and we're swiping on each other's apps, and he's on Tinder, and he's just swiping, and he got to a person, and he just swiped so quickly, and I was like, "Did you even see them?" And he goes, "Oh, well, they're too Asian for me." And I was like, whoa, okay, I don't know if you're joking or not, but I have to call you into I don't believe in calling people out. I want to call people in. So I said, look, you're my best friend. I'm going to call you into a conversation. Let's talk about this. Like, joke or not, there's some truth to it, right? There's always some little truth to the jokes that we make. And the fact that you can just see that someone's Asian within those 3.4 seconds and then swipe, that is the sort of problematic behavior we want to challenge, right? It's not saying that you have to find every certain person of a certain background attractive, but I would encourage people to ask themselves, like, how many people are they dating outside of what's normal for them? How many people are they dating outside of their background? And why aren't they? Right? Have they had really bad experiences with a certain culture that just clashes with theirs? That's a valid thing to be concerned about. It shouldn't preclude you from that entire group of people, right? We don't want to engage in stereotyping people and saying like, oh, all of this group of people are the same, so I'm just going to steer clear of them, right? I had 3 terrible first dates with Frenchmen and then ended up falling in love with one for a full year, right? So we can't just say like, oh, well, they don't appeal to me, and then ride them off. We have to recognize that that bias exists, and we have to challenge that. And so I think, to get back to your original question of when did I start being open to that intercultural, interethnic dating, it was during the pandemic, where I sort of think that most of us just had time to pause and reflect on what was important to us, and we had less distractions. And I think for me, it was a moment of, okay, well, I'm dating and I have more time now, and I'm really glad that I was able to consciously sort of think through that, because now I sort of have completely different types than I had growing up. And I'm like, oh my God, I missed so many great opportunities because I just sort of didn't think that I was interested in something. So yeah, it's been recent, but it's been really, really nice because I sort of see people in a different way now. And that's what I would want for people, is that they can sort of unlearn their biases and change their perspective. And we all have the ability to do it. It just takes, we have to do the work.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you said about puberty, actually, because it made me really think about my own life. And I was in an all boys school when I was like, from 8 to 13.
Oh, I'm jealous.
And there was only there was one other black kid in the class, right? In my class. And I'm trying to think of, the other classes. I can't quite remember. And I know him. I still know him, actually. And
is he cute and single?
No, he's married.
Oh.
Missed his wedding, unfortunately. Then I went on to another school And it was a similar makeup. There was like, I think there's probably like 2 or 3 black kids in my class. And I was just used to that way of being. And there's like mostly Asian girls, mostly white girls, that was the kind of makeup.
Mm.
And it's funny now, when as we were saying about puberty, because I look now and go, okay, who was I fancying through puberty? Like, what sort of women were I looking at? But I also add into the mix is like, what was my experience of how they reacted to me as well in puberty as well? We don't always think about that, right? Because I'm thinking now back to like, I was like bullied by a lot of black boys when I was like, especially, 13, 14, 15, because I was too white, right? I was posh and all these things. And that really got to me. Like at that age was like, oh, wait, I'm trying to connect with you and you're like hitting back at me for something that's nothing to do with me.
I was called Oreo. I think they call it different things here, like coconut and things like that.
Coconut, yeah. And it was all it was all to do with the way I spoke. Because you speak like a white boy.
Well spoken, You don't sag your pants and you're well spoken, you get good grades. All of a sudden that makes you white.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a whole other conversation.
Right? We could get into that another episode.
And I now look and go, okay, because like you, I had to then see that I was dating, white women, I was dating Asian women, I dated black women when I was young as well, like a mix, but it was just a predominance towards white women, if I just be really honest, right? And it wasn't that I was not willing to date black women. It's just that part of my psyche was like, they're not interested in me. Because I remember times where, remember, go back 15 years ago, I was a dating coach going into clubs every single week. I was going to clubs 4 times a week sometimes, and I'd go into bars and clubs. And I remember talking to black women and them being incredibly hostile to me. And I remember being like, hey, I'm just trying to be nice. I'm trying to have fun here. I'm not like, I don't want anything. And then you go to a group of, say, white women, and they're just like, hey, let's have fun, let's laugh, let's joke. And I remember being like, what the fuck? And it kind of fed into my existing narrative, right? And it wasn't till probably in my late 20s where I was talking to one of my friends, and we were like, oh man, like, we're not really dating women that are of our same race. And I started to go, okay, why is this? Like, what's going on here? And I could see I had my own biases, as you were saying. And I really put that to the test a number of years ago, before I met my now partner. Was like, is it that I'm biased against black women, or is it I'm looking for certain traits and values and things that I want in a person and want them to be doing? And when I'm in those places, I don't meet any black people as well, right? Like, if you, maybe some of you might want to disagree with this, but if you go to like a lot of the events I would go to around like consciousness, awareness, sexual positivity, like meditation retreats that I went on, like all these sorts of things, I'd go there. I'm the only black person there always, like every single time, And it was interesting that when the spaces, because the space I was interested in,
those spaces probably aren't inviting for certain people.
Exactly. And I even had a conversation with someone else about this on his podcast, a guy called Cam Fraser, and he was saying about how in Australia he does events, and he goes, it's just white people. He's like, I don't know what to do to make those spaces more inviting. And I was like, well, you need to have people on the lineup that are not white as well, right? But it's like, it really had me to start to look at, it was like, am I biased against black women? There's definitely a point in my life where I was, like you saying about the swiping. I'd just go, okay, you're black, you're not going to be into me. Like, I'm not going to try. Or you don't want a man like me, because that's part of also the narrative I was holding. And I think this is super interesting, because often people might look at people like me and you and just go, they just don't want to date black people because they think white people are better and blah, blah, blah. And there is some of that programming. It's like you said, we are told that white European standards of beauty are the pinnacle. But there's also partly in there our own experience of what we've experienced and what was around us that also shaped that. And also, you can't underestimate things like, our values, what we want for our lives, how the way we live our lives. Like, I'm an extensive traveler. Like I've traveled all over the world. And even when I traveled, this was something that always made me sad. When I stay in hostels, I could probably tell you the number of black people I met. I spent 2 years traveling around the world. I can tell you the number of black people I met in hostels, like staying in a hostel, right?
I don't think I've ever met a black person in a hostel.
I think I've met in about, I've been to what, 51 countries in those 2 years. In that 2 years, I probably met about 20 to 25. And I would say that at least 15 of them are American, and British, maybe 7.
Yeah.
Also.
Then you're adding
right?
in that layer of socioeconomic background and
Yeah.
No, but I love that you talked about, like, it's not just our preferences and bias, but it's also the response of people, right? And how we're perceived by them. Because you're right. Like, if it takes 2 to tango, right? Or in some cases 3, 4, etc. And so it's not just your preference, but if you have an experience with people not liking you, right, or treating you a certain way, that's also going to dictate who you go for, right? For me, it's this microaggression of Black men having big cocks, right? It's like it's a microaggression. It might be one of the more positive ones, but there's also a negative side to it, right? Because it can add pressure to a relationship.
And you get reduced to just a cock.
Exactly. And I think you talked a lot about this, but it's sort of like, it's flattering in a way. Like, yes, biologically, physically, there's evidence to suggest that our cocks are probably larger than the average person that they're measuring. Fine. What I don't like is when I'm fetishized for it, right? When you reach out to me and you're like, I bet you have a big cock, right? It's like, okay, cool. Is that where this is going? Right? Like, is there nothing else you see of me? And so that then will change how I relate to other people. But I don't know about your experience, but for me, as I was thinking about this conversation, the only people who've ever asked me or directly commented on the size of my cock without ever mentioning or meeting me are white.
Yeah.
And for me, it's just an interesting sort of like, I had this preference towards white people, but then also they were the ones who were fetishizing me and they were the ones who were reducing me. And so it was sort of this cognitive dissonance. And part of what I was talking about is sort of changing my own narrative and changing my own preference made me realize that there were spaces I could exist in where I didn't feel reduced to that, right? Like where, and you talk about this a lot, like your manhood is often comes down to the size of your cock. And to be in spaces where you could feel safer, it also made me realize, oh, well, there's benefits to dating different cultures, right? And so it was so interesting. I loved that when you were talking about sort of the response to people as well, because it definitely shapes your preferences, how people, if you're in spaces where, for me, it was being around white people and then their parents probably, and often I would hear suggesting that they don't date Black people, right? Or meeting their parents and meeting their family and picking up on all the microaggressions and picking up on all the things where they were uncomfortable, right? Those things sit with you and they change your perspectives, and it's unfortunate because it stays with you for a long time, and it takes a lot of work to unlearn that those have no business sort of dictating or sort of defining who you are, and that you have to sort of let go of that. And it's a challenge.
Yeah. I remember years ago when I was probably like in my mid-20s that I would meet women, white women who wanted to date, who only dated Black men. And
that's another thing. It's like, okay, that sounds good on the surface, but let's unpack that a little bit. Like, what is it about that? Like, are you trying to be rebellious? Is it a BBC thing? Like, what's the
And I come to realize that they had an expectation of what a Black man was. Like, they would expect me to be kind of some sort of hood 50
I was going to say
type
thuggish.
guy. Yeah. And then I would rock up and be like, well-spoken and shit, talking about all these beautiful countries I've traveled to.
And I love that you put in air quotes, because I hate this idea that like Black people can't be well-spoken. So I love that you did that.
Yeah. And it'd almost be like they'd be surprised. They'd be really shocked, but also they would also be like, and then I would be like, oh wait, you're just I know what you are.
You want the Black person you saw in movies and TV.
Yeah. And I'd be like, I'm not like that at all. And if it was, say, a bar, then I could just like get out and be like, okay, bye, have a good time kind of thing. But if it's like you're on a date, it could also been like a bit of unlearning for them, because I would talk about my life and my experiences, the great things I do, and then they'd be like, oh wow, those things sound really cool. I've never think about doing those sorts of things in my life.
Yeah.
And then usually, it usually end there. I can think of a few times when I just had like casual sex relations with a couple of people where it would just be like they were probably, as I would say, they're more ghetto than I am. And that's what they wanted, and I'd be like, yeah, cool. But it used to be quite funny, and I've found that as I matured a bit, as I started to find myself in more mature spaces, and I no longer had that. But I also found that, like you said, the cock comments, I didn't get those anymore. When I was moving in, meditation retreats, or meeting people through my podcast, or how have I been meeting people in the last few years, like a lot of like sex positive communities and things like that, those comments about cock size and things like that stopped really happening. The only people they still come from really are men, right? They still come from men, like white men, Asian men as well. Asian men are South Asian, like Pakistani, Indian, Bengali men. That still comes from there. And I used to just kind of brush it off. But more lately, there's two ways I kind of take it. Is like, obviously it's a big insecurity with them, right? But also what I said is it's reductive, right? They're reducing you to just that simple thing. So they'll say, oh, of course you're going to get girls because you've got a big cock. But it really shows how they view the world. They view interactions and relationships is that, they think that women just want big cock. But it also then reflects back on them, because you can see that they think that women are just about simple things like money, size of pecs and things like that. Yeah. And it's also usually the things they don't have, right? So they're focusing their life, their dating life and so forth,
projecting their insecurities on you.
Yeah. It's like, oh, well, I don't have these things and I'm, I can't do anything. And it's been interesting to see that, because, I imagine that, I've got stories of when I was like playing cricket as a kid, and like, the older men wanting to see my cock when I was like 13 years old because they wanted to see how big it was, stuff like that felt like, to the point where I just never went in the shower, because I was just like, oh my God, these guys are going to try and touch me or something like that. My mum was a social worker, so it's like I was really primed around pedophilia and all that. I really knew about it from a young age. So it was like kind of wild in that way. But to segue back from pedophilia into dating.
Different episode, maybe.
Yeah. You touched on something around meeting parents, because I think this is always an interesting dynamic, and I've done it numerous times. You are Black man, or if you're listening, you're an Asian man, or whatever race you are, and you're going into a family of a different race. It's a really interesting adventure, should we call it?
Yeah,
because sometimes you're the first one. You're like, I don't want to say Christopher Columbus, because that's really bad connotation.
Because he didn't even discover, quote unquote, the Americas. Exactly. They weren't existing. But okay, yeah, I know what you mean.
But it's like you are the first person to get to
introduce
the North Pole.
Them. Yeah, introduce them to something different.
How's that been? How's that been for you?
So it's only ever happened for me twice. So when I was in high school, I was dating a girl. When you're that young, the wind could blow by and make you hard. So let's, I'm a gay male. Let's not confuse anybody. I mean, it is a spectrum, but I was dating this girl and I met her family. And I think because I was a different, like, I was the well-spoken, and I put it in air quotes, I was the sort of smart, educated Black man. They sort of, it almost like they didn't see me as a Black man, right? They just saw me as a man who happened to be Black. And that's a difference, right? There's a difference between them seeing me as a man or a boy that their daughter is dating who happens to be Black, right? It's almost like, oh, we'll excuse that because of everything else. And he's a Black boy. There's a difference. And I think growing up in that very conservative military town that I did, it was just like, oh, we can excuse that, right? Because I dressed properly and I was well spoken and I got good grades and all of that stuff. And we had also met in church. So there was another sort of like, oh, okay, this is safe. This is a safe Black boy, right? So I think for that experience, I didn't really, I didn't really notice. I think I was too young to really be aware of microaggressions, like not to be aware of them, sorry, but to know what they were, right? Like I've experienced racism and homophobia growing up. And I think as an adult, I can look back to it more and pinpoint it. But with that relationship in particular, I don't think that I sort of necessarily ever felt like, oh, this is going to be a problem, because I think I was just used to it. Like I said, I grew up in white spaces. All my friends were white. So it wasn't, for me, it wasn't anything weird. The more recent experience, I haven't actually, and I don't know if I will, meet his parents in person. But I sent his mom flowers once, and I also he talked about the fact that he introduced me, said who I was to them, and my first question was, "Did you mention I was Black?" And I asked that for a reason, and he said, "Yeah, it came up." I showed him a picture, and I said, "Okay, cool." And it was important because I need to protect myself. I don't want to get into situations or spaces where they're not going to realize it, right? Because there's nothing to hide. I'm a proud melanated brother, right? Like I love the version of myself that I am, and I never want to be in a situation where I feel hidden or where I feel like I can't be my full self. And so, any situation that happens in the future where that's going to be, oh, I mentioned you to my parents, I'm going to ask them, "Did you mention I was Black?" Because one of two things will happen. They'll say yes, and I'll say, "Great, cool. You're not ashamed of me," and also they're prepared. Right? They shouldn't have to be, but they're prepared, quote unquote. And then on the other hand, if they say, "No, I didn't," then I'm going to say, "Okay, why? Why didn't you mention?" Right? Like, I don't want to hear the excuse of, "Oh, I didn't think it was relevant. I don't see you as different." Like, no. Let's just be honest, right? We're in an inter-ethnic, interracial, intercultural relationship. Well, let's address these things. Let's not hide from them, right? It goes back to the conversation we started about let's stop avoiding these issues. Let's just be real with them. There are challenges to intercultural dating, and that's not a bad thing. It's not something to run from, right? My ex-partner was French and white. I am Caribbean, born in the States. We have different backgrounds, right? There are going to be things that we're going to have to learn about each other. And when we try to integrate families, that's going to be a challenge as well. Let's not run from those issues. Let's just put them out on the table and respectfully discuss them. So for me, I fortunately haven't had those experiences, but I know plenty of people who have had those sort of walk into the family and then the parents say something, right? Or it's that little microaggression. And it sucks to not feel wanted or included. And I know how it can feel from the perspective of like other people in my family, right? Like my sister's ex-wife or my brother's current wife, like, they were both white. And so coming into the family, I can attest to the fact that it goes both ways, right? This isn't an us versus them scenario. Everyone is new to this idea. And so everyone is allowed to have struggle, right? They're allowed to not be comfortable, right? But do they show that? Do they openly, talk about it and say, "Hey, I want to be vulnerable," or do they show it in a way that's like disrespectful and shows disdain? That's the difference. Anything that we're talking about in this conversation, for anyone listening, let's make the distinction between, yes, we're all biased and we have preferences, versus how are we acting on them? How are we challenging them, right? Yes, we can all feel uncomfortable about things, but how are we then manifesting that? I think that's the difference. No one's saying that you can't have certain things or be used to certain things. And, let's just recognize that we're all human. We all are different people. But how do we then act on those? That's what makes the difference between someone who's racist or someone who's racially problematic and not. Right? It's how you act on those impulses and those biases and how you let them manifest.
Yeah. That's a really important thing to say, actually. To see the difference is like, what are you doing about it? Ultimately, it's like, what are you doing about it? Yeah. Are you admitting that there's some bias? Because we all have bias. Everybody has bias. Every person of every race has bias in some way. And it's about saying, yeah, I have bias. And like, what am I doing to challenge my bias? Like, where am I going at my way to go, okay, how can I challenge this bias I have in my head? The truth, the truthfulness of this bias. And also when you're challenging it, you're challenging it from a place of awareness as well,
Mm.
of not going, okay, I have this bias. I think, I don't know, all black men are dangerous. And then when I go to a place and there's black men there, I'm now also looking for their dangerous behavior to confirm my bias.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
what I wish people would do, this is my recommendation. We can talk about sort of, how can we encourage interracial dating? We can talk about, what if you're someone in a relationship who's inter-ethnic, intercultural? My advice is that when you get to that stage of introducing to your family, but also your friends, let's not forget this is happening with your friends as well, right? If your friends are from a certain demographic or certain psychographic or whatever, and you're introducing someone new to that, I think we should be having the same conversations with friends and family. Let's prepare them, right? Let's stop this idea that like everyone just has to be woke and ready on the spot. Like let's remove that. Like let's not just throw these surprises and be like, oh, you just have to accept them right away, right? What I would love for my future partner is I want you to do the work so that I don't have to. I want you to be an ally and take care of the uncomfortability and the vulnerability that is going to happen so that I don't have to. Take care of the microaggressions in advance, right? Before you introduce me to your friends, before you introduce me to your family, have that conversation. Say, hey, you're gonna meet Hakeem or Kimmy, and he's black, and I love him for all that he is, and let's have a conversation now so that he doesn't have to. What questions do you have right now, right? I don't want a situation where he feels uncomfortable, because it's a tricky thing, right? You've got your family and your friends who you're really close to, and then you've got your partner. So I'm not going to act like it's not a challenge to balance, but you have to step up. Don't put it on your partner to do that work. And it goes both ways, right? Black, white, South Asian, East Asian, whatever the mix is, you should be doing that regardless, right? Even if you're both from the same background, religious, socioeconomic, race, ethnicity, all of that, you should still be preparing your closest people for that person, right? Because what we have to recognize is that they're only ever going to get your perspective of the relationship, the ups and the downs, right? So if you're bringing someone for them to meet, say, look, sometimes we talk about the negative things in my relationship, but I want you to know they're actually a really good positive influence on me, right? Like sometimes I just come to you to vent, but I want you to realize there's also good, right? Let's not make it a separate, like, oh, we have to have a sit down conversation about race. Let's make it a part of every other conversation that we already have. Let's stop making it feel like it's something that is different and has to be sort of extra. Let's just fold it into the other conversations, right? At the same time you introduce and say, hey, I'm dating somebody new, mention where they're from, what their background is, what their ethnicity is, all of that, because it's part of who they are. Let's not have it be some separate thing where you're like, oh, I'm dated David, and oh, yeah, he happens to be, from Jamaican descent. Like, no, it's not the exception, right? Let's say, hey, I'm dating David, and he's black, and he's a podcaster, and he's a sex therapist. Let's wrap it all in together. Let's not make it this separate thing. So I think that's my advice for people introducing, someone to their family and friends. Like, do the work so that they don't have to, right? Be an ally for them. And also, if people are, and this is, tangentially related, if people are interested in like, okay, interracial dating, interethnic dating, and they're like, sort of, where do I start? Right? Like, let's just be clear that this isn't something to like fetishize, right? We're not suggesting that like, oh, okay, you should go out and find a black person to sleep with, or you should go find an Indian person to sleep with because then you're woke, or then you're an ally. Like, that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about, let's make genuine connections with people who are different from us, because that's how we bring harmony to the world. Like, let's figure out, okay, where are my biases, and how can I fight against those? So swipe with that person, right? Who you're like, at first you're like, oh, right? Challenge yourself and be like, oh, okay. The kombucha meme where she's like, no. Well, do that, right? Like, sort of have that moment where you're like, okay, this isn't something that I'm used to doing, but it doesn't mean there's something I can't do. And then just go for it. Like, this isn't like, you don't need some sort of training to be in an interethnic, interracial relationship, right? I think where there's more work to be done is that, and we can talk about this, I don't even know where we are at Attack of Time, but I'm loving this conversation. Like, I think there are challenges that come through. Do we have time to talk about that? Like there are challenges that come through with
definitely
with interethnic and interracial dating, right? Let's not sugarcoat it. You're not just going to magically sort of be in perfect harmony, right? Like you probably experience it as well. For me, the microaggressions can be a real challenge when you're dating someone who you love and care about, right? Because it almost feels like it's more hurtful than if it's just some wanker who's just like, is not important in your life. So I think that was something for me that it was, again, this dissonance, this cognitive dissonance of like, you have a preference and you're attracted to white men. And also they're the most likely to fetishize you and commit microaggressions. Like you're almost setting yourself up to fail. Like you're
like
bringing,
you want the pain.
yeah. It's almost like you're a masochist, right? You're sort of like, so that was a learning curve for me. I just got out of my first relationship, and that was something where I struggled a lot. And I had to talk to some of my friends in interracial relationships because I said to myself, it would be so much easier to date someone from my ethnic background, right? And that's why I say there's genuine concerns around people saying, oh, not the protect our bloodline thing, that's a little bit too much, but this idea of like date within your culture. There's genuine reasons why people say that, because it is easier. It can be easier if I were to date someone who just understands. If I don't have to explain why that person gave me a look and why that was a microaggression, if I don't have to justify my experience or validate my lived experiences, my life would be so much easier, right? So that's something that on my end, if I'm dating a white person, that I have to get used to, right? I have to constantly recognize that I'm going to be in a state of education often, right? Because when things happen, they're going to look to me, right? I'm going to have to be like, yeah, that's why that happened. And it was rewarding. There was a time where the Olympics were playing, and my ex-partner and I were on the couch watching, and the camera was like panning through all the track and field athletes. They go like lane by lane. And they went through like this Chinese sprinter, and then I think there was a Dutch sprinter who was white, and they went through, and then I got to this like black, I think she was Trinidadian person, and they just like went right past her, didn't even say any facts. And I thought in my head, I didn't say anything. I thought in my head, I was like, that's weird. They just said all these little special facts about everyone, and they just skipped her. And I shit you not, my ex-partner right next to me was like, well, that was weird. And I was like, yes.
I know that one.
I loved it. I was like, yes. That was a moment where I was like, fuck, yes. Like you're getting it. You're getting it.
You're hearing me.
You're hearing me. You're paying attention. You're starting to recognize it. And so there's challenge and reward. The challenge is that, for someone who's coming from a marginalized community, whether it's for their socioeconomic background, their ethnicity, their gender, there's going to be things where they're going to have to educate you. And so I think, if you're interested or you're in an interracial or interethnic relationship, recognize your privilege in the relationship, right? If you're in a straight relationship and you're the man, recognize that as a female in that relationship, there's going to be things that she may or may not tell you that you might need to be aware of. Right? Recognize that if you're in a gay relationship or in any relationship where the ethnicities are different, recognize your privilege, because that is, I talked about this earlier today about doing the work for your partner so they don't have to, being an ally, right? That's in line with that as well. Like recognize that there are going to be moments where they're going to call you into a conversation that's going to be uncomfortable, but it's so that they can continue to have you as a safe space, right? So be aware that there's going to be a challenge, right? If you're a person where you're going into or thinking about an inter-ethnic relationship, I love that for you. And I think, as I said this before, it sounds dramatic, but I really do think inter-ethnic relationships are going to be the way that we end so many of the problems of the world. And also recognize that there's going to be challenge with it. And that's okay, right? There's going to be tension and challenge, but that's how we bridge the gap. And so just recognize that there's going to be learning and unlearning in that relationship. And for the people who are maybe from those marginalized communities, right? The women in the relationship, the Black person in the relationship, et cetera, recognize that it can be a challenge as well for you, right? Because there are going to be times where you have to feel like you have to validate your experience. And that's why I do the work that I do, right? Because the reward will hopefully outweigh the challenge. Yes, it is a challenge to talk about my lived experience and have to justify myself or explain why that person asking me for my receipt or that person stopping me in the airport is problematic, right? Don't be that person that's like, oh, well, I get stopped sometimes too. Don't be that person. Don't be that partner that tries to one up them or match them. Just recognize that their experiences are going to be different from you, and that's okay. You don't have to understand that, right? Just know that they're valid. So that would sort of be my sort of advice, so to speak, is that like, I love people going into interethnic relationships. Please do more of it, but also recognize that there's challenge with it as well, and that you should lean into that challenge.
Yeah. Amen. A lot of those things you said, like, it's not always easy. It's always easy on both sides. Like last year, I think, I was getting to know also, pandemic hit and we end up living together for 6 months.
And just for anyone listening, your partner's white. So just so
most people know. My partner's white, she's Swedish, so she couldn't be any whiter, to be honest, if she tried. Like, whiteness has been her bloodline forever. And at certain times of the year, she's pretty pale too. She won't listen to this. I don't have to worry.
I love this. I love where this is going. Keep going.
But for her, like last year, when everything happened last summer, it was like a bit of a wake up for her. She read a few books, and a bit like you were saying with your partner watching the Olympics, we were watching Ozarks. Right? The series, the third series, right? For those of you that know Ozarks,
don't spoil. I'm still not on the third season, so don't spoil. Okay. I've seen the first two seasons, but no spoilers for anyone.
There's a black woman in the third series.
Ooh, okay.
And she is a FBI agent, I think. And as we're watching it, was also reading Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race.
Great book.
And as the series unfolded, as she was reading, she was just like, she's basically saying to me when we're watching certain shows, she was like, this show has just stereotyped black women in the way that black women are always stereotyped. And I was like, yes. Yep. And then she'd be like, they've done it there again. And then there's this other thing. And have you seen over here where they did this? And then
it's like their eyes are open.
I'd be like, oh God, I'm not even seeing half of this anymore, because I just ignore it now. You just ignore it.
You're so desensitized to it because you have to. You can't. That's what people don't always understand, especially as a gay black man. You can't engage with people on every single microaggression they use, or else you'd spend your entire day fighting against ignorance. Yeah,
exactly. So, she was starting to see this, and she was just like, wow, this is like
fucked.
This is really, it's really fucked up, because it's like a powerful narrative that keeps getting portrayed again and again and again. And, in those times, like, it really did make us closer, because she started to really understand some of the things that I'd been through. And even some of the statistical stuff that she was reading through the book, she was just like, this isn't, she comes from a background of like data and marketing and PR. And she was like, some of the studies that were publicized in newspapers through like the 70s and 80s were done on such small sample sizes that today they wouldn't be classed as a proper study. But back then, like, people made big conclusions about blah. She was just like, they're insignificant studies. But what's been really interesting in our relationship really has been her parents, right? She's had to talk to her family and her parents, right? Like, they're like, okay, she didn't really hide that I was black. And I guess in this age, I also caveat that in this day and age, it's much easier to not have to tell them that your partner is black or Asian, because you have social media and photos, right? You put photos up and stuff like that. When I was maybe like in my early 20s, people didn't have photos. You're
dating yourself now.
Yeah. So you'd have to say this is what they're like. But she's really been like, David's black. Like, is this something we need to talk about? Is this a problem for you? Like, do you have any questions about this?
I love that direct approach. I love it, because it doesn't avoid the issue. It just says, look, is this going to be a problem? Like, I understand that you might have questions. Let's hash it out. I love that.
Yeah. Like, what does this mean? And I know she's had a conversation with her father around like having children, right? And he said, and I'm going to preface this because I think this is a really good conversation I had, and some people may disagree. Her father, said, okay, so your kids won't look just like me, right? And she's like, no, they'll be mixed race. They'll be like,
that's when you start to unpack that anxiety and those fears of those people, because they're like, oh, wait, I was excited to have grandchildren that looked like me.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily being racist, but they're just sort of fearful of something that they're losing.
Yeah, and he also was able to verbalize this and say, yeah, okay, cool. So now he's starting to do the work in his brain to be like, okay, what are they going to look like? And like, I know, even like, I've got a young nephew who's very, very light skinned. So like, we've shown him pictures of him. So it's like allowing his brain to go, okay, cool, this will look like. Okay, that's super cute. That's nice, blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
But if
I mean,
you
let's be honest,
just
mixed race babies are gorgeous. Like, come on.
But it's these conversations with family that are so important, just so that that they can be prepared. Because otherwise, if you don't prepare them, it's a shock, like you said.
Yeah.
But it's like there are, you know, you have to do this work. It can be tricky with family, but it also, you're not just helping yourself when you date someone interrelationally, even a relationship. You're also then allowing your family to do the work to unpack their bias, right? Which, in fact, as I said before, when you do the healing for yourself, or you know, you then heal this down your bloodline. Like, these problems won't come in and be a problem later on down the line, right?
You're
It's
stopping
like,
that
because of
generational
just
trauma from happening to your children and continuing. And it's heartwarming to hear that, because then we hear the other side of it publicly, which happened with the royal family, right? And how Harry and Meghan had to deal with one of the royals. I think I know which royal it was. It's definitely Prince Charles. Let's just be honest, right? Like, they said it wasn't the grandparents, and you just know that Prince Charles and Camilla were having this conversation about what skin color the baby would be. Now, jokes aside, Harry is white and Meghan is light skinned. In what version of the world did you think that Archie was going to look like you and I? Like, let's just be clear. Like, why was that even a question? What skin color is he going to be, right? But it's the fact that they didn't have to do the work. So Meghan was the victim of their microaggressions, right? And that's what's so unfortunate, is that is that they didn't do the work for them, right? In your example, your partner did the work so that you didn't have to be the brunt of that, and that's great. But we have so many examples where that's just not the case, where someone has to hear that, right? And that's so disheartening. Like, imagine hearing your in-laws or your future in-laws saying something like, oh, well, what's the skin color of this child going to be? First of all, why is that relevant? And second of all, how exclusive is that, right? It doesn't feel great. And so I think that's the takeaway for people, is that, like, in order to be an ally, it means that you're sometimes going to have uncomfortable conversations with people, right, on their behalf. And you have to do it. You're not speaking for them, you're amplifying their voice. But let's get away from this idea that allyship is just reading books and watching movies, right? It's a lot of self-work. And also, it's you stepping into the line of fire, so to speak, so that someone else doesn't have to be the victim of that. And I think that's where people have to start recognizing, is that there's work to be done, right? It's a lot of self-work. And there's also mental and physical and emotional and financial effort that you have to put into your allyship. And so whether it's with dating or anything else, those uncomfortable conversations are often the thing that you have to have. That's how we change the world, one conversation at a time. Yes, there are these macro things we can do with governments and businesses, but when it boils down to it, it's you having that conversation with your racist or racially problematic grandparent or parent, so that you and your children don't have to go through that. That's how we sort of fix these problems, and we stop this generational trauma. It's not easy, but it is rewarding.
Yeah. And it's super rewarding, because you're able to change so much in such a small way, right?
Yeah.
With these conversations. And it also means, and this is one of the things that we didn't necessarily say, is this also means your relationship will be better, right?
Yes, because you're not hiding behind things.
Yeah, you'll understand each other better. You'll have more open conversations. You'll be more connected. You'll be able to integrate someone into your family a lot easier, right? Like, it's a lot easier in that way. It's like, on the reverse, for instance, right? Give an example. When I told my mum about Warsaw, I was like, oh, she's from Sweden. She does this. A bit like you said, bit of CV. She's like, yeah, she grew up in Sweden. She did this when she was here for a while, and blah, 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 blah. And mum was like, okay, cool. I was like, okay, so does she cook Swedish food? Jamaican mum. What do you
really want to know, Mom?
But and then even you know what? So a little thing that I did. So when Orsa was coming to my mum's house, I told her what the food was going to be. I was like, this is what she's going to cook, right? She'll dumb it down in certain areas because she knows you're white and you're Swedish, so maybe it won't be so spicy. But there's probably going to be these foods and this, and this, right? I even went out of my way before also went to my mum's, is like to introduce her to Jamaican cuisine and food, right?
I fucking love this. I love this.
Because then you're introducing your culture to your partner, right? And again, it goes both ways, right?
Yeah. So that they don't make a face when they eat something and then upset your parents and things like that.
Yeah. Or be like, oh, what's that on the plate kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So then also took it one further, right? My mum cooks escovitch fish, which is this really beautiful kind of fried fish, right? Jamaican fried fish. Google it. I want to come
to, because I miss the Jamaican cooking of my dad. So I need to come to your house.
Yeah. And she was like, I really want to learn to cook this. Like, what should I do? And I was like, just ask my mum. My mum will love it. I was like, my mum will love that you want to know and know how to cook the food. She will be over the moon.
Amazing.
So she went to my mum's one afternoon. I wasn't there. I was like at home chilling or doing whatever I was doing. Right. She went over there, spent time with my mum, learning to cook this fish. Right?
I love this for them.
Right. Learn to cook this fish. Now, fast forward, she goes back to Sweden to see her family. And she's like to her mum and dad, I know this fish that you're going to love, right? David's mum cooks this fish. It's really good.
My heart is so warm right now. I love it.
And she taught me how to cook this fish, right? I'm going to cook this for you. Now, do you see there's levels to that, right? So I've introduced her to the food.
Swedes love fish too. So this is big.
Yeah. She's had it at my mum's place, but now she takes that food to her parents
and that
to
cultural exchange.
Yes, exactly. So it's like, okay, they've seen parents, they've seen pictures, of my family and stuff that we do. And like even my sister, the stuff that she does, like she's been on TV and newspapers and she tells them. And it's this way in which you're bridging your families together, both culturally, so that you're creating cohesion before they even meet. And this is something that a lot of people miss because they're afraid to do it, right? They don't want any of the uncomfortability that might come up with it. But actually, you smoothing those bumps before the families or your partner has to meet means that it's a much smoother road, which is exactly in line with what you were saying before.
It's doing the work. I love that cultural exchange. And it can be with so many things. It can be with food, it can be with language, right? What if you were to teach the greeting that you usually use to your partner, right, in advance, right? Or let's not take it to like appropriation where you're like, oh, dress a certain way, but it's sort of like, what other cultural exchanges can we have? And I think it's not just with families, right? It's also with friends, but also with each other, right? Don't be afraid to be your full authentic self with someone, right? Don't be afraid to say like, hey, we went out to this restaurant and I saw you make a face about this thing. And like, let's have a conversation about it. Let's maybe, try the food, or like, let's stop being afraid to have the conversations we need to have, right? The more vulnerable we are, the more safe we can feel and the more authentic our relationships can be. And I think it's so beautiful, that cultural exchange. And I hope I have that opportunity with a future partner, because I think it would just be so amazing to be able to share different cultures and how people grew up. And this is, I don't want anyone else to, in this conversation, to feel like, oh, this doesn't apply to them, right? There is some level of cultural exchange that can exist in your relationship, whether you're dating, single, married for however many years. There's some level of cultural exchange that you can bring to your family and your friends. And so I would just encourage everyone to explore that interculturality. I just made that word up, but it sounds nice, that exists in your relationships and in your friendships. We're talking about relationships. They're not just romantic ones, right? Let's talk about the platonic relationships we have as well. Let's make sure that we're having cultural exchanges with our friends, right? Because our friends can often be our chosen family. So let's not forget and think this is just something we do in our romantic lives. Let's also think about in our platonic relationships, how are we showing up? Right? Do we have that psychological safety in those relationships or not? So I think, we've mostly been talking about romanticism, but let's also think of intercultural and interethnic relationships from a platonic perspective, right? And the friends that we have, look at your friend group, look at the people closest to you. Is there a lot of diversity in there? Gender, sexuality, neurodiversity, profession, age, right? Like, Are you surrounded by diverse perspectives? And if not, like, why not? Is that a choice? Is that just by happenstance? And I'm not saying go out and find some Black friend or go text your gay friend and be like, hey, we haven't caught up. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that these same rules or tips apply to our platonic relationships as well. So when we're finding new relationships with people, right? Birds of a feather flock together, right? Affinity bias, in-group bias, those are well-researched phenomenons that show us that we give more trust and we feel safer around people who look and feel like us. So if you're looking around your friend group and you're like, hey, that's not that diverse, like ask yourself like why that is. Is that just because of how you grew up, right? Or is that because you're actively selecting the people you talk to? Are you going to networking events and only approaching certain types of people? Right. So these same things apply whether it's platonic or romantic. Like, let's make sure that we're engaging in interethnic and intercultural relationships in all aspects of our lives so that we can create harmony, right? So that we can bridge those cultural divides and so that we can unlearn the biases that we have. So platonic or otherwise, I would just encourage people to seek out those perspectives that they're not used to, and don't be afraid to lean into those conversations that might be difficult.
Amen. Amen. That's, yeah, really beautifully put. Because it's like a spider's web, it just goes all around us. We can all do this little bit of work, right, with the people around us to really just spread an understanding and learning of culture throughout. It's just like, it's easy to do. Most of this is what we just said there, especially with friends. It's really easy to do. And like, it has such an impact that we're not always aware of because it impacts them. It might be their children, whatever it is. Like, it really ripples out. And this problem of racism that we are tackling and have been tackling and probably will tackle forever, right? It's those little actions that you can do, right, every day of your life, whether it's with your friends, your family, your lovers, your partners, that have a huge reach that you just never will see.
And that's what it means to be anti-racist. It's an ongoing challenge of the isms, the sexism, the racism. It's an ongoing challenge. It's not a checkbox item where you're just one and done, right? It's constantly in your relationships. Every single day, you're going to have these challenges, especially if you're in a romantic relationship and maybe you're living with your partner or getting to that stage, right? These are going to be things that are constantly happening. So don't let up, right? Keep that same energy that you had last summer, next summer, and the summer after that. Like, keep that same energy. And I hope people continue to keep learning and unlearning and having those difficult conversations and challenging the status quo, because that's the only way we're going to grow and fight this pandemic that is racism.
Beautiful, wonderful sentiment. Can't agree more. Yeah, I feel like that's a really perfect way to round off, actually, because
this has been great.
Everyone.
Awesome.
I feel like we could have talked for easily for 2-3 hours if we were left to it without any.
We need a spin-off. We need like you got the Authentic Man series, and then we need like a spin-off where we just talk about like all the issues that came up. I think pedophilia was one. No, we won't talk about that one. But like, there's so many different conversations that we could be having, because I think one of the areas we should also explore at some point is also the intersectionality of racism, and especially some of the other sort of challenges around homophobia, for instance. Like, as a Black gay male, I've experienced racism in the gay community. I've experienced homophobia in the Black community, right? So there's a lot of intersectionality that we should talk about as well at some point. So that would be an interesting part 2 to this conversation.
That would be a great part 2. And I imagine the listeners are wondering where they can hear more Kimmy, and maybe even they've got businesses and they want to bring you in to help them do the work.
Yeah, no, thank you. Definitely check out our website. We are at www.theantiracistsocial.club. We're on Instagram, theantiracistsocial.club. And we actually just launched this huge piece of work. It's a quiz. You can find it at link.theantiracistsocial.club/quiz. And you can take it from the perspective of an employee or leadership, and it will tell you how diverse, inclusive, equitable, and accessible your organization is. And then it will spit out customized recommendations based on your answers and give you sort of an assessment that then we can discuss. So check that out. We're constantly posting interactive and digestible content on our Instagram, and our website is about to go through a huge revamp, but currently it's got over 500 resources right now for learning. Wow. So you can filter by age, by topic, by type of content. So let's say you've got a 12-year-old who likes podcasts in history, right? You can filter out all of the resources and it will say, check these out. Wow. We've got tons of resources for parents. I mean, we've got a lot on there. So definitely check it out. And if all else fails, always feel free to reach out, DM us and send us a chat. And we're always happy to help you be a better ally. So yeah, check us out.
Amazing. That's a lot out there for people to digest and learn from. That's a lot.
Yes, there's never too much that we can learn and also unlearn. And there's a lot of work to be done. So if you're not sure where to start, get in touch and we'll let you know.
Awesome. Thank you, Kimi, for a wonderful conversation. This was incredible. I almost lost track of time at one point. It was that good.
Well, thank you for having me, David. And I look forward to many more.
You're welcome. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Feel free we'd love you to reach out to us through Instagram or email. Feel free to reach out and, let us know what you learned from this episode, what you're taking away, what you're going to action in your life, and maybe even in your own relationship, right? That would be wonderful for us to hear about.
Awesome.
Cool.
Talk to you soon.
Next week, people. Ciao, ciao.